The human woman had always lived carefully, knowing her home stood close to the boundary where predators roamed. Her cottage was small, its roof patched with straw, its walls shaped from rough stone, yet it gave her comfort. She was used to the distant howls at night, the faint rustling of paws in the tall grass, and the glowing eyes that sometimes appeared just beyond the firelight. But on this particular night, the stillness was broken not by a howl, but by a strange scratching at her wooden door. At first, she thought it might be the wind shaking loose a branch, or perhaps a wandering animal looking for food. But the sound came again, soft yet steady, a claw against wood, almost hesitant. She held her breath, her heart beating quickly. Slowly, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. What she saw made her freeze. There, in the flickering glow of her firelight, stood several predator cubs. Their fur was bristled, their small bodies trembling, their eyes wide, not with hunger but with fear. These were the same cubs she had heard about from whispers in the village, creatures raised and trained by the aliens as spies, meant to stalk humans, to learn their ways, and perhaps even to deliver their weakness back to their masters. Yet, here they were, not hiding in shadows, not pouncing at her throat, but gathered together like frightened children seeking shelter. The woman blinked, her mind racing. She had heard stories of hunters who dared to cross paths with the young predators, and none of those stories ended peacefully. But something about the way these cubs crouched low, tails tucked, shivering in the cold night air, stopped her from slamming the door. They did not look like spies now. They looked lost. She knelt down, cautious but calm, and studied them more closely. Their paws were muddy, their sides scratched, as if they had been running through rough ground. One whimpered softly, the sound, low and aching, and pressed its head against her doorstep as though begging for entry. Against her better judgment, her heart stirred. She wondered what had driven them here, away from their den, away from their handlers. Instead of pushing them back into the dark, she stepped aside and allowed the cubs to creep in. They moved carefully, their claws clicking lightly against the floor, their eyes darting to every shadow in the room. She could feel their nervous energy fill the space, but none of them made a sound beyond soft whines. They huddled together near the fire as if they had known its warmth before, yet longed for it now more than ever. She stood at a distance, unsure if this was a mistake. Perhaps the aliens had sent them directly, testing her, watching to see how she would react. Yet when she looked closer, she saw how one of the cubs shivered so hard that its whole body shook, and how another leaned its small head against the shoulder of its sibling. Whatever reason had brought them, it did not feel like a trick. It felt real. She moved slowly to gather a few scraps of food from her shelf, a crust of bread, some dried, meat she had saved, and a bowl of water. The cubs lifted their heads, noses twitching, but they did not lunge. They watched her as if waiting for permission. She set the food on the ground near them and stepped back. For a long moment, they only stared. Then, one of them inched forward, sniffed, and with a quick movement, snatched a piece of meat before retreating back to the group. Another followed, braver now, and soon all of them were nibbling, their fear giving way to quiet hunger. The woman sat down on her chair, leaning against the wall, watching silently as the fire flickered across their fur. She had always been told to fear these creatures, that their purpose was destruction, that they could never be trusted. Yet here they were, filling her small home with soft chewing sounds, their eyes glancing up at her with something that was not hatred, not malice, but the cautious look of beings unsure if they belonged. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The cubs, once trembling, began to relax. Their eyelids drooped, and soon they lay curled near the warmth of the fire. One, the smallest of the group, crept closer to her chair and curled at her feet, its tiny breaths soft and steady. She reached down, her hand hovering above its fur, hesitant. Then, with the gentlest touch, she brushed her fingers across its head. To her surprise, the cub did not flinch. It gave a small sigh, the kind only creatures at peace could make. The woman leaned back, her thoughts swirling. She could not know what tomorrow would bring, whether the aliens would come searching, whether the cubs would be taken back, whether her choice tonight would mark her as a traitor or something far worse. But for now, she only knew this. They had come to her door not as spies, not as killers, but as frightened children seeking safety, and she could not turn them away. The fire burned lower, filling the room with a soft glow. Outside, the wind carried distant cries from the dark wilderness, but inside her home, there was only stillness. The predators, who should have been her enemies, had chosen her door to scratch upon. And as she watched them sleep, she felt the faintest sense that something had begun to change, not only for them, but for her, and perhaps for all who would hear this story in the days to come. The woman stood in her doorway for what felt like forever, staring at the small predators huddled on her step. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the choice before her. Everything she had been taught told her to close the door, to keep the fire burning bright and pretend the scratching had never come. But something in their eyes, wide, lost, full of a quiet plea, kept her frozen. Against reason, against fear, she opened the door fully and stepped aside. The cubs hesitated at first. Their paws shifted on the stone, claws clicking as they looked at each other for guidance. Finally, one crept forward, its body low and cautious, and padded across the threshold. The others followed, pressed so close together they nearly tripped over each other. She closed the door gently behind them, sealing out the cold night air. For a moment, silence filled the room except for the crackle of the fire. They didn't attack. They didn't roar or snap their teeth. Instead, they moved toward the fire like children drawn to the warmth of a hearth. They circled once, then curled close together on the rug before it, their sides touching, their trembling slowly easing. The woman stood near her chair, still unsure. She had expected tension, growls, a reminder that they were not pets, but wild things. Yet all she saw was exhaustion. Their eyes fluttered half shut, their ears twitching, as if the fight that had brought them to her door had finally drained out of them. She lowered herself into her chair and simply watched. She could not understand why they had come here of all places. Their den was strong, dug deep into the earth, guarded by their own kind. And yet something about that den had driven them away. Something about this small home, with its old stones and faint smoke, had pulled them instead. Her gaze softened as she studied them more closely. Their paws were scratched, their fur dirty with mud and leaves, their sides carrying faint marks of old fights. One of the larger cubs flinched even in sleep, as if remembering something unpleasant. She had seen fear before, in animals and even in people, but this was different. It wasn't fear of her. It was fear of something else, something behind them, something they had chosen to leave. She sighed quietly and rose to fetch what little she had. On her shelf lay a crust of bread, a small piece of dried meat, and a clay bowl. She set them down near the cubs, her movements slow so as not to startle them. At first, they only sniffed the air. Then one lifted its head, nose twitching, and took a cautious step forward. It lowered its muzzle to the bowl, lapped at the water, then darted back. Another crept forward, nibbling at the meat before returning to the safety of the group. The woman smiled faintly. She hadn't realized how tense her own body had been until she felt the relief of their simple trust. They hadn't taken her hand or allowed her touch yet, but they had accepted her offering. That was enough for tonight. The firelight danced across their fur, making the room feel warmer than it ever had before. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes growing heavy as the night deepened. Yet she stayed awake, watching them. She knew the danger that came with her choice. If anyone found out she had welcomed predator cubs into her home, there would be questions, accusations, even punishment. But as she looked at their small forms breathing slowly in sleep, she knew she could not have chosen otherwise. One of the cubs shifted and let out a soft whine, its paw twitching in a dream. Without thinking, she reached down and gently brushed her fingers across its head. The fur was coarse but warm beneath her touch. To her surprise, the cub leaned into her hand instead of pulling away. A quiet sound, almost like a sigh, escaped its throat, and it settled back into stillness. Her heart tightened. These cubs had not come here by mistake. They had chosen her door, chosen her fire, chosen her presence. Not because she was strong, not because she demanded it, but because they sensed something their den had not given them: safety, trust, a place where they could rest without fear of harshness or command. She sat quietly, her thoughts heavy. She had never seen herself as someone remarkable. She was just one human, living on the edge of wild lands, doing her best to survive. And yet tonight, she had been chosen. Not by people, not by her own kind, but by creatures the rest of the world believed untamable. That realization carried a weight she could not explain, and yet it also gave her a strange kind of peace. Outside, the night stretched on, filled with distant howls and the whisper of wind through tall grass. But inside her small home, all was calm. The fire burned low, casting a soft glow over the room. The cubs lay in a loose circle, their breathing steady, their small chests rising and falling in unison. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched over them, a silent guardian of the peace they had sought. She didn't know what the morning would bring, whether they would stay, whether they would return to their kind, whether others would come searching. But she knew one thing for certain. The bond that had begun tonight was not built on fear or force or command. It was built on trust freely given, on a shelter offered without demand. And though she did not realize it yet, this small act, letting them in, sharing her fire, offering food and safety, was the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond her cottage walls. A story that would be remembered not for violence, but for the quiet power of kindness. The morning came quietly, with the pale light of dawn spilling across the hills. The woman stirred from her chair, stiff from a night spent keeping watch over the cubs. The fire had burned low, leaving only a bed of glowing embers. She blinked, and for a moment she thought she was still dreaming because the cubs were still there. Huddled together, their breathing soft, their fur catching the last warmth of the coals. But as the first rays touched the window, the cubs rose. One by one they stretched, shook the sleep from their bodies, and padded toward the door. They glanced at her, their eyes lingering in a way that felt almost like a farewell. Then, without growls or hesitation, they slipped back into the wilderness, vanishing into the tall grass that lined the path. The woman sat in silence for a long time. Part of her wondered if the night had been some strange dream. Yet the faint paw prints on her floor, the crumbs of food gone from the bowl, and the warmth she still felt on her hand where one cub had leaned into her touch, told her it had been real. By midday, the whispers began. She was not among the predators, yet their voices traveled far, carried on rumor and echo. Warriors muttered in harsh tones. They said the cubs had abandoned the safety of their den to seek a human's fire. They said this was a break in tradition, a dangerous weakness. Cubs were meant to grow wild, to learn loyalty to their clan, not to strangers. Some believed the cubs had been bewitched. Others claimed they had been softened. The woman did not hear these words directly, but she saw them in the eyes of those who passed near her home. Shadows lingered in the way figures paused on the ridge, or how distant silhouettes turned their heads toward her cottage. It was as though suspicion itself had taken root in the air, watching her as closely as the cubs had that first night. By evening, the elders of the predators had spoken. Though their language was not hers, the meaning was carried by the tone, by the gestures, by the grim silence that followed. They had warned her. She was not to interfere again. The cubs were theirs to raise, their ways theirs to protect. The human had no place in their traditions. She listened, though no answer was demanded of her. She only stood in her doorway as the message was delivered, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, the setting sun casting long shadows at her feet. The words were meant as a boundary, a wall built to keep her apart. Yet something inside her heart stirred, not in rebellion, but in quiet sorrow. That night, she sat by her fire again. She did not expect the cubs to return, not after the warning, not after the looks she had seen. She tried to still her thoughts, tried to focus on her own survival. Yet when the scratching came at the door, soft and familiar, her heart leapt in her chest. They had come back, one paw, then another. A whine, low and uncertain, the sound of claws brushing against the wood. She froze, her hand hovering above the latch. The memory of the elder's warning was fresh in her mind. To open the door was to invite disobedience, to accept defiance not only from the cubs, but from herself, and yet she could not turn them away. Her hand lowered, the latch lifted, and the door creaked open. There they were again, eyes glinting in the dark, bodies pressed close to each other for courage. Without hesitation, they slipped past her into the warmth of the cottage, circling the fire as though it belonged to them. The woman closed the door slowly, her heart heavy with both joy and unease. She knew this was no longer a one-time moment. The cubs had chosen her, and they would keep choosing her. Every scratch at her door was a choice against their own, a small rebellion whispered in the dark. Each night became the same. No matter what words the elders spoke, no matter how sharply the warriors glared, the cubs returned. Sometimes with mud on their paws, sometimes with scratches on their hides, but always with the same determination in their eyes. They came not for command, not for discipline, but for shelter, for warmth, for the soft safety of her quiet presence. The woman began to wonder what the cubs saw in her. Why her? She had no strength compared to the warriors, no knowledge of their traditions, no claim to their world. All she had was a fire, a little food, and a heart unwilling to push them away. Yet perhaps that was what they needed most, not dominance, but refuge. And though she never spoke of it aloud, she began to feel it too. That same pull, that same trust. She had lived alone for so long, her days marked by quiet work and her nights by silence. But now the silence was broken by soft breaths, the flick of tails, the faint sounds of cubs settling into sleep. Her home felt different, less empty. More alive? The whispers outside grew louder. Warriors called it weakness. Elders called it defiance. But she called it something else. She called it choice. The cubs had chosen her door, chosen her fire, chosen to return even when told not to. That meant something. Something neither the warriors nor the elders seemed to understand. And though she could not put it into words, she felt it deep in her chest, steady and undeniable. This was no accident. This was a bond forming, quiet as embers, stubborn as roots. And bonds like that, once formed, were not easily broken. The day of the trial came with a heavy silence. For days the clan had argued about the cubs, their strange behavior, their nightly disappearances, and the whispers that followed them like shadows. The elders had decided it could not continue. The cubs would be tested. Their loyalty would be proven in front of all, whether to their clan or to the strange human who had stolen their hearts without trying. The woman did not know what to expect when they came for her. Warriors stood outside her small home, their faces cold, their movements sharp with judgment. They did not speak much, only gestured for her to follow. She wrapped her shawl around herself and stepped outside, her steps slow, her chest heavy, with unease. The cubs were already gone. She could feel it in the emptiness around her, in the quiet air that carried no soft scratches at her door. They led her into the heart of the clan's territory. A wide clearing stretched before her, encircled by tall rocks where the crowd had gathered. Warriors lined the ground, their shoulders tense, their hands resting on weapons. The elders sat in silence, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of anger and curiosity. This was no small test. It was a judgment, and all eyes were fixed on her. At the far side of the clearing, the cubs were brought forward. Their growls were soft, uncertain, as they were pushed into place by the warriors. Their ears were lowered, but their eyes kept flicking toward her, finding her in the crowd. She felt her heart tighten at the sight of them, small yet brave, standing in a circle of tension and expectation. A horn was sounded. The trial had begun. The warriors stepped forward first. They barked orders, sharp and harsh, words heavy with authority. They shouted commands, trying to draw the cubs into obedience, trying to remind them where they belonged. When the cubs did not respond, whips cracked against the ground, loud enough to make the crowd flinch. The cubs bristled, but their eyes did not turn to the warriors. They turned to her. The woman did not move. She did not speak. She only stood where she was, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze steady. Fear stirred in her chest, but she swallowed it, knowing any sign of weakness would only be used against her. The warriors grew harsher. They circled the cubs, growling their own commands, raising their weapons in mock strikes. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to see the cubs cower or submit. But the cubs did something else. They broke formation. With sudden swiftness, they darted across the clearing, their small bodies weaving past the warriors, ignoring their shouts. Dust flew beneath their paws as they ran, their eyes locked on one place only, her. The crowd gasped as the cubs reached her. They pressed against her legs, curling around her feet, their bodies trembling but resolute. One pressed its head against her hand. Another leaned against her knees, and soon the entire group formed a wall around her, tails brushing her ankles, eyes glaring out at the warriors as though daring them to come closer. The clearing fell into stunned silence. The warriors froze, their whips slack at their sides. The elders exchanged sharp looks, their expressions unreadable. The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading like wildfire. None had expected this. They had expected the cubs to fear the human, or at least to remain loyal to their clan under pressure. But instead, the cubs had made a choice that no one could deny. They had chosen her. The warriors tried again. They stepped forward, shouting louder, their voices laced with fury. But the cubs only pressed closer to her, their growls rising in defiance. They stood firm, not against the woman, but for her. To them, she was not prey, not an outsider. She was safety. She was warmth. She was their alpha. The woman felt her throat tighten. She had not asked for this. She had not sought to challenge the clan, nor to take the cubs from them. All she had done was open her door, share her fire, and offer what kindness she had. Yet here they stood, choosing her not out of force, but out of love and trust. The elders finally rose, their voices cut through the murmurs, commanding silence. They declared that the trial was over. The cubs had spoken through their actions, and no amount of force could deny what had been shown before all eyes. The choice was made, and it could not be undone. The warriors raged. Some shouted that it was unnatural, that the human had cursed them, that the cubs were lost. But others in the crowd saw something different. They saw loyalty born not from fear or dominance, but from trust freely given. They saw that what no warrior or elder could achieve, the human had done with nothing but patience, warmth, and quiet, strength. The woman looked down at the cubs gathered around her, their small faces turned up to her with trust so pure it ached in her chest. She knelt slowly, resting her hand on one, then another, feeling the steady rhythm of their breathing. Trial had been meant to prove her weakness. Instead, it had revealed something else entirely. Not her power, but her heart. And in that moment, under the gaze of the clan, the cubs had chosen her as their alpha, not through command, but through love. The story of that day would not be easily forgotten. It would echo in whispers and retellings, not of fear, but of a bond that defied every expectation. The clearing still hummed with tension long after the trial ended. The cubs refused to leave her side, pressing close against her as if guarding her from the disapproving eyes of the clan. Warriors shifted uneasily, their pride wounded, their sense of order broken. The crowd whispered, voices carrying questions that no one could answer. And above it all, the elders sat in silence, weighing what they had just witnessed. The woman knelt slowly in the dust, her hand resting gently on the cub's fur. Their warmth was steady against her skin, their breaths calm and trusting. She hadn't spoken a word during the trial, and yet her silence had said more than any defense she could have given. The cubs had chosen for themselves, and their choice was undeniable. Finally, the eldest among the rulers stood. His face carried the deep lines of age, but his eyes burned with thought. He spoke not with anger, but with a voice that trembled with something closer to uncertainty. "These cubs," he said, his hand gesturing toward the small bodies at her feet, "have turned their backs on fear. They have chosen trust. Never before has this been seen in our history, not with our warriors, not with our own blood. Yet here they stand, bound not by command, but by care." The crowd grew quiet, every ear straining to catch his words. The warriors lowered their whips, though their jaws tightened with frustration. Another elder leaned forward, her voice sharper. "This is dangerous. If one human can undo generations of discipline with nothing but softness, what will happen to the rest of our young? What becomes of our ways?" The old man did not answer at once. He looked out at the cubs, at the woman sitting in their midst, at the strange peace that had replaced what should have been chaos. Then he said slowly, "Perhaps our ways are not as unbreakable as we believed. Perhaps there is more strength in this kindness than we ever thought." Gasps moved through the crowd. Some nodded. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The woman lowered her eyes, not seeking to challenge them, only holding her place quietly. She had not come to change their world. She had only opened her door to frightened cubs. Yet now, here she was, at the center of something greater. The elders called for a pause in judgment. They withdrew to speak among themselves, leaving the clearing filled with restless murmurs. The cubs remained where they were, curled protectively around her feet. She stroked their fur gently, whispering to them in a language they did not fully understand, though her tone carried all the meaning they needed. When the elders returned, their decision was not what the warriors had hoped for. "She is no longer to be treated as an intruder," the eldest declared. "She has proven that. She is not an enemy, but a bridge. If our young see her as an alpha, then we must learn why. Perhaps there is a lesson here, one that our strength alone could not teach." The warriors bristled, their pride stung. To them, it felt like weakness to bow to the will of cubs, to honor a human's influence. Yet they could not argue with what had been witnessed in front of all. The truth was undeniable. Fear had failed. Force had failed. Tradition had failed. And yet this quiet human had succeeded. From that day, her place changed. No longer was she the fragile outsider, whispered about in suspicion. Now she became something else, a figure of curiosity, of possibility. The cubs followed her openly, no longer sneaking to her door in the dead of night. They walked beside her, tails swaying, heads lifted high as if proud of their choice. At first, the clan watched with unease. But slowly, some began to see what the cubs had seen. Her patience, her quiet strength, the way she gave without asking. For control, it was something foreign to them, yet strangely powerful. She showed them that bonds did not need to be forged through fear. They could be built through trust, through care, through respect. The children of the clan whispered her story with awe, repeating it as though it were a tale meant to be remembered. The adults spoke of it in hushed voices, half in disbelief, half in wonder. And the elders began to discuss her more openly, not as a threat, but as an unexpected teacher. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the camp, the eldest elder approached her directly. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. She shook her head softly. "I only opened my door," she said. "They came to me, not because I called them, but because they needed warmth." The old man studied her in silence for a long moment, then nodded. "And yet, what you gave them was more than warmth. You gave them choice. You gave them something even we, their own kin, could not." Word of the event spread beyond their territory. Other clans heard whispers of predator cubs who had chosen a human as their alpha, of elders who admitted that perhaps strength was not only measured in dominance. The story traveled on the wind, reshaped in every retelling. But its heart remained. The same, one human, with nothing but care, had changed the future of predators and their people. The woman did not seek fame, nor did she demand recognition. She lived simply, as she always had, with the cubs now part of her daily life. They guarded her home at night, hunted near her fields, and played in the grass around her. They were not her pets, nor her servants. They were her family. And in return, she became theirs. Over time, even the hardest of warriors began to soften. Some would come to watch, curious to see how the cubs moved with her, how they obeyed without fear, how they rested so peacefully at her side. A few even began to ask her questions, hesitant at first, then with genuine interest. She answered, as best she could, though her words were always simple. "It is not about control," she told them one evening as the cubs lay sleeping. "It is about trust. If you give them safety, they will give you loyalty. If you show them care, they will stand with you, not against you. That is the path forward." And so, slowly, change began. Not all at once, not without resistance, but it began. The elders saw it, the cubs embodied it, and the woman lived it every day. She had not planned for this, but she accepted it. She understood now that her role was more than sheltering cubs or surviving as an outsider. She had become a bridge, a proof that even the deepest traditions could shift, and that even predators could learn peace. And in the years that followed, long after that night of scratching at her door, her story was told again and again. Around fires, in whispers, in songs, it became not just a memory, but a lesson. That kindness can shape destiny, that trust can overcome fear, and that sometimes a single human's open door can change the path of an entire people.